Hey, welcome to the HELSIS Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obiodum, Associate Professor of Sustainability Science with Global Development Studies as the chair. Our speaker today is Lochner Marais, Professor of Development Studies and the current Director of the Center for Development Support at the University of the Free State, South Africa. He connects from what's often called the world's most unequal country, South Africa, where Marais lives a life of constant tensions and contradictions. His strong anti-apartheid politics and scholarship and zealous commitment to principled and just change, both personally and professionally, often sees him torn between consensus, dissent, and denunciation. Based on these specific historical and material conditions and context, he has, over the last 2 decades, developed a thesis about global ecological crisis, which totally contradicts current thinking, whether on the left or on the right. According to Professor Marais, the ecological crisis are based on long-term institutionalized inequalities and social stratification, both of which are likely to persist, perhaps even deepen, whether there is more growth, degrowth, slow growth, or no growth. Based on wide and varied data sets collected over a period of more than 20 years in coal towns, he suggests that coal mining has created such deep inequalities and is built on a labor structure that is so racialized and gendered that neither more growth nor mere degrowth can address years of ecological injustice. Even more controversially, he suggests that debates about phasing down or phasing out coal, which dominated media reportage of the COP26 conference in Glasgow, missed the point. Because either way, the thousands of people employed directly in coal mines, the millions of people indirectly involved in coal mining, the nations and regions dependent on coal are likely to go through deep and dark distress. Just transition and the so-called Green New Deal might look like a panacea for the green left in the West and their comrades in the South. But he argues that in the highly racialized, gendered, and informalized South African coal mining context, these two are much ado about nothing. Most people who work are not unionized, so their connection to just transition, typically framed around formal work relations, excluding migrants and minorities, is merely rhetorical. In any case, the coal question is not new. As far back as 1906, when William Stanley Jevons wrote his famous book, The Coal Question, an inquiry concerning the progress of the nation and the probable exhaustion of our coal mines, he railed against conventional wisdom, which he noted was, quote, the fickleness of statistical numbers, end of quote, while pointing to the fallacious thinking about alternatives in the form of renewables, or to put it in the words of the economist, quote, the only way to keep growing is by leaving fossil fuels behind, end of quote. But Marais is no Jevons. His passionate arguments, indeed his cri de coeur, are sui generis. We cannot simply slow down the pace of economic change, as Jevons suggested. We need to take more fundamental steps, center the coal question, indeed the sustainability question, on long-term inequalities and social stratification in cities, regions, nations, and the world at large. We need to go beyond just transition in formal workerist terms and include local governments, local communities, and minorities in the discussion and actual implementation about transition, both at the local and at the global levels. But for countries and regions like his, South Africa, where coal is a source of some 90% of energy supply, social stratification persists, and the ruling group is a workers' party. Is a coal phase out utopian, and does coal phase down address the question of just transition? How just must the transition be locally and globally? Why did he write such a book which goes so much against the grain of current thinking about sustainability? In other words, is this the right time to be against both the conventional wisdom and the Western left consensus? With the authority of experience as a South African working on coal throughout his career with a vast team of researchers across several fields, Professor Marais joins me now on the Global South Encounters to clarify his diagnosis and original alternatives contained in his latest co-edited book, Coal and Energy in South Africa, Considering a Just Transition, published by Edinburgh University Press only a few days ago. Welcome, Lochner, and perhaps let's get into the substance of your book by beginning with an overview, including why you co-edited this work, how you and your collaborators went about your work, and what your key conclusions are, followed by questions and comments by all of us, and then you can respond. For the audience, our practice is to turn off our videos and mute our microphones while others have been given the virtual floor. But questions about the book can be sent to me in the personalized chat box.
Thank you so much, Franklin. What I'm going to try to do is to give a sort of a broad overview of the book, and at the end reflect a little bit on some personal issues. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Edinburgh University Press, to Franklin, and to 4 co-editors that have helped in putting this together. So although I am at the microphone this morning or this afternoon, there are also 4 other editors and about 25, 27 authors that have contributed. And when one edits work like this, you sort of see all the different dynamics in this process. So a special word of thanks. So while I was doing the thanks, I put on the slides about how this looks, and in general in the coal fields, and you can see how this would affect, and it gives you a sense of what I will be talking about. So as Franklin said, still 90% of coal, of South Africa's electricity depends on coal. There's this long history of dependence on what is called the mineral energy complex, but at the same time there is talk and some action about moving towards renewables. How does this look in practice on the ground? So I would talk about some kind of environmental crisis. You've seen some of that in terms of pollution. In the book is specifically about Emalahleni, about nearly 500,000 people, about 40,000 coal mine workers in the area, and about 20,000 workers in the electricity provision. So about 60% of the economy is directly linked to this coal energy complex in this area. Now, of course, this all takes place against requirements to scale down on coal-fired energy provision, the Paris agreements and various other agreements that then requires that to be scaled down in the next 10 to 20 years, and it's a dramatic scaling down. So within this, the idea was to think a little bit about what is a just transition. Is it possible? How just can a just transition be? And this takes place against sort of the context of the global north that have built their economies on coal, and now are sort of propagating using alternatives, renewables, but still the history can't just be wiped out in this context. So our book takes these questions to the local level. So often these debates are at the country or the international level, and I think that's fine. What we try to do with the book is then to move to the local level. And I've got two quotes, one a couple of days ago from the Daily Maverick, which says, while Team South Africa was negotiating what was described as a watershed 131 billion rand multilateral climate financing deal in the air-conditioned halls of the conference center at COP26, some of those most affected by the transition were in Mpumalanga's suited covered ground, seemingly unaware that their livelihoods were being negotiated without their consent or input. The second quote is from a deputy minister in the South African cabinet that about 2.5 years said, there was no referendum in the South African coal fields on whether South Africa should sign the Paris Agreement. And this is the heart of the issue. So it's global politics, it's global ideas about how to do this, and at the end, it's local people in a fairly remote location in South Africa that needs to deal with this. And what we're looking at in the book was, to what degree, from different perspectives, different views, to what degree do we think it's possible in this local context. So we, like all researchers, we tried to develop a set of questions that guided the book. So very briefly, it was about the implications, what the implications of mine downscale and closure are, how mines, government and labor and union plan to deal with this, the degree to outsourcing and contract work, how does that create inequalities? Are there other inequalities with mine workers that they create? Is the mining industry in Emalahleni responsible for specific gender inequalities and negative consequences for women? Does the influx of mine workers cause social disruption? Do the high levels of environmental degradation and poor environmental health create long-term inequalities? Is Emalahleni's coal industry sustainable, and what would a just transition mean? So these were broad questions. I'm not going to return to them, but these were the sort of initial questions that we asked as we start. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to very briefly try to reflect on the various chapters and try to get to what are those one or two cases or issues that we need to highlight. So chapter 2 of the book starts off with a discussion of the concept of just transition, emphasizing the historical link with labor, and sort of concluding to say, but there is need to expand the definition and the understanding of just transition from a labor-only point of view to a more broader context, to include community and include the broader context. So to some degree, there's a shift from workers only to communities, which we take on in chapter 3 and ask, but if we think about communities, and we think about just transition, we also need to think about the reality of closure in this context. And one of the problems in the closure literature is that the just transition literature comes sort of at the back end, at the end of the mining cycle, and the mining industry to a large degree puts all the effort at the start and all the money at the start. So it comes at a point where the industry as such doesn't really have the stomach for this, but it's such a crucial issue. And there's this contradiction that chapter 3 then tries to largely emphasize. So decline and closure then comes at a point where the industry can't pay for it, don't want to pay for it, want to close their operations, while the implications of that then becomes the responsibility of government, communities that stay behind. And that's sort of the point of chapter 3. In chapter 4, the authors of chapter 4 went to a great length to try and show what the current inequalities are that mining have been creating. They point to inequalities between mine worker households and households not linked to mining, with mine worker households substantially better off on most indicators. They point to the inequality between mine workers belonging to working for mining companies versus contract workers. So that stratification through the mining industry, where you've got mine workers paid by mining companies and contract workers paid by contractors, brings it's a difference in salary, it's a difference in what they can actually put together in their livelihoods. So with that, the question then becomes, so what's the implication for decline, closure, and just if this is the current reality in the case? And I think that it deals with, on the one hand, contract workers will be the first to go in a transition, but probably the least qualified. And in that sense, the existing inequalities can prevail, or are most likely to prevail in this case. In chapter 5, the researchers move to an understanding of what the changing nature of mine work has been over the last 20 to 30 years. So to some degree, one needs to acknowledge that mining companies have actually managed to create fairly decent work comparatively to its historical work, especially for those people that work for the mining companies. It's not always clear what happens to contract workers, but to some degree there's been major improvements. It's probably still not perfect, but major improvements in applying normal legislation and labor legislation and work health issues in the workplace. The paper then goes a little bit further and says, but there are also then these differences between, for example, the quality of life of people belonging to unions, much better than those not belonging to unions, and often the contract workers in that case. And it goes on with that, also indicating that there are fairly high levels of organizational commitment, but there are problems of home work conflict and issues around, probably around extra work, extra hours that create this. Of course, the question then is still what happens at closure and decline. And again, is this existing inequalities between contract workers, non-contract workers that probably will continue into future. Chapter 6 looks a little bit more at the large-scale informal settlement development in the area. So you've got specific policies that have been developed, very, very modernistic in approach. But despite those policies around home ownership, there's a second settlement typology in informal settlements. Large numbers created by mining, to some degree created by what is called normalization in the mining industry, closing down mining villages and mine housing over the last 30 years have shifted people into the urban areas of Emalahleni, and that has contributed to informal settlement development. And it's sort of contradictory to what policy wants. But it's also a result, that policy is also a result of both, or not both, but government, mining companies, and to some degree labor that have agreed on a specific policy approach. And this is part of the outcome. So there are also examples where housing looks better, but it's this dual system that it does create in this regard. So decline as in the housing field is difficult to think about. But on the one hand, you need to think about the policies government has put in place for home ownership, mortgages, etc. And if the client sets in, what happens versus people in informal housing. The profiles of the informal housing segment of our work shows to a large degree that these are not necessarily mine workers, but people, informal workers around the industry that come in because there are some monies around that they can live off. Then chapter 7 is an interesting chapter in the sense that it looks at the environmental consequences, and I think the paper then says that there are existing environmental concerns, but that these concerns will probably be there for centuries. So although you could probably stop air pollution, the implications on land rehabilitation and the opportunities that you can create beyond mining remain limited with acid rainwater, the water systems of the river systems being impacted in this process. So although you can reduce the air pollution, these mining implications will probably be there for centuries to come, limiting the possibilities of at least on land what you can do. Chapter 8 goes sort of with chapter 7 in the sense that it talks a bit about the health implications. It shows through health profiles that there are very specific health outcomes in the area linked to pollution, to the air problems. However, the more alarming thing in the long run is that the paper also shows the dependence on mine infrastructure, health infrastructure. And because there's a dependence on mine and health infrastructure, government has not always invested well in this field, and there's sort of an underinvestment of government infrastructure. So then the question becomes, what is the long-term implication of closure, and how would government then use mining infrastructure? So it's will probably be a transfer from mining infrastructure to government infrastructure, and the evidence globally shows that this usually goes with some problems, and it requires a new attention to the area in this context. So at the one point, or at the current situation, there are serious health-related issues, largely linked to air pollution. In the long run, it could be that there's an underinvestment in health infrastructure. It's likely to be in that way if it's not managed appropriately in this regard. Chapter 9 evaluates the sustainability reporting for the mining companies in the area. Now, so the author makes sort of two main points. The one is the quality of reporting remains really poor, and secondly, there's a lack of what she calls context-based reporting. So there's a lack of understanding specific situations in specific places like Emalahleni. So companies tend to report generally about general things and not thinking about specific issues, for example, the context in Emalahleni. The third point, and that is more my interpretation of when I read this, is that transparency and these systems of reporting are set up for transparency purposes. And when I read through it, I can't see how that helps local communities in any significant way. So despite a system that needs to support this, it's not always clear how this is done. Chapter 10 is a chapter about the perceptions of coal mining and coal energy, and looked at how mine workers and non-mine workers and by gender people think about coal and how they're dependent on coal. So there is a high level of dependence with people directly involved, but it's also not as big as you would find elsewhere in the world. It's usually women and older people that are a little bit less inclined to accept the coal industry, And you can understand that these are usually the people that suffer from poor air, poor breathing conditions, and need to look after children in these situations in the process. So although there is a continued dependence on coal in the perceptions, there are some groups that are starting to see and starting to experience this, or wanting to see some change in this regard. Chapter 11 is about the local business value chains. And the question is, to what degree do businesses see the possibility of decline, and how would they react to this? And as well as against the context of government that over the last couple of years have put in lots of effort to try and build in local linkages in the value chains, sometimes more successful than others. But the one problem in the interviews from business that comes to the fore is that very few people actually see the likelihood of decline and thinking about that in their own business situations. And there is some dependence. If 60% of the economy is dependent on this coal energy link, then businesses are linked into this dependence, and very few see this in the process. So very few people are willing to think and plan about closure in their business strategies. Chapter 12 is about day laborers and the informal economy, and what the authors did here was to link a previous work with a new survey of day laborers in 2017, and to a large degree the initial signs of decline is seen in the informal sector. Increased numbers of people looking for jobs as day laborers, substantially more than 10 years ago. They find less work, so of course there are more people, but the money is also less. And the implications of closure is hard for these people that are surviving informally in an economy that depends on coal and energy to some degree. And I think if you think about stratification, then these day laborers, largely black men, are at the bottom end of the system, and it doesn't hold well. Chapter 13, 14, and 16 are about planning, and the question is, so can one plan some transition in this regard? And chapter 13 sort of uses mainstream planning strategies, and we contrast that with chapter 14, where the argument is more one of planning for, or planning in the dark. So how does one plan without knowing what the future is? And part of the response from the authors of chapter 14 is to say that it becomes sort of a relationship that you need to develop, and you need to plan, be able to be flexible, as opposed to chapter 13, where there's a bit more fixed system. And we've put these two chapters together to try and show these differences. And personally, I think there is something to this notion of far more flexible, trying to plan in the dark. Chapter 16 talks a little bit more about local government finances, and unfortunately, ironically, it's the place where energy is created in South Africa, but they own the South Africa utility Eskom, one of the largest amounts of money in the system. So there are institutional stumbling blocks that need to be overcome. Thinking about the long term, thinking about planning in the dark, as well as some of these local finance systems, because the local government finance system is under huge pressure, and decline might just mean even more pressure in this regard. Chapter 15 is a qualitative piece of work, and to some degree, the argument of the authors is that there's, in the absence of appropriate local government responses to planning and maintenance, there is an expectation that the mind should do this. Of course, it's an expectation built on the wrong assumptions. It's an expectation that does not take into account that the mines might actually close in the long run. And it plays within that context, try to understand how people have got this huge expectation that not just their local government, but that mines should do these jobs. 4 points in my conclusion. It's the third last slide, if you can just bear with me. So the story is a story about state versus company power, and I call it as a phase of socially embedded neoliberalism. And I want to make the point that I think to a large degree, so no, maybe just step back. So often we use this as a way to criticize capitalism and big companies and multinationals, etc. And that's fine. However, I think there are enough examples how the planning system and how government and even labor have been sort of embedded into the system. And the housing examples I used earlier are probably the best, where labor together with government and mining companies have gone onto a system where private ownership, housing finance, mortgages is sort of the only system available. And in that sense, it just feels to me that there's some embeddedness from about everybody into the system that's been developed in the last 30 years to some degree. I've made notes about the front-end approach versus just transition. I think this is a crucial issue, conceptual issue, that the just transition literature often ignores and quickly go over without understanding what it means and how to deal with it. To give you an example, at least one of the larger coal producers have now unbundled its coal into a separate, smaller company, and essentially because of not wanting to deal with the long-term consequences related to coal. And that's what companies are going to do in this process. We can have many ethical issues with them, but that's going to happen, and to some degree we need to think about that very carefully. I've referred to the planning and municipal finance conundrum, this notion of can we solve the problem versus a notion of a little bit more planning in the dark, a little bit more flexible in the process, and unfortunately that's not always the case. So we sometimes fixed into existing systems that makes it very, very difficult. And then the fourth issue is the anticipated social consequences, further stratification along lines of race are probably very much on the line if decline takes place. Also thinking about the gender implications in this regard, that would be considerable down the road. So the question is, so is a just transition then possible? And I don't know. I think it's sometimes used a little bit as a simplistic answer to a very complex problem. But I think it requires, if we want to think about it carefully, it requires a more realistic understanding of closure and the disruption that brings. I think that's the first point. The second one is we need to think about it in the broad and community implications. Just thinking about mine workers is a very narrow focus. We need to think about the role of governance in this, and I think there's some validness or some merit in thinking about the literature of shrinking cities. So the value, how do we think about the value of decline in these coal areas? And there are very good examples of thinking about this as reconnecting places with the ecology and then the fifth one is there an economic alternative? So there are some high-level talks about getting substantial numbers of renewable energy into the area. Whether that's going to have enough jobs for mine workers that have got a very specific skill set is a different question, and whether that would mean some kind of ownership, community ownership, and ownership from people that lost their jobs. That's also a question that needs to be asked in a sense. So when I try to conclude, it's about the concept might just not be enough to deal with the existing inequalities, to deal with a rapid disruption that closure would bring in this regard. So I'm a bit skeptical about a simplistic assumption that we can solve this problem very simply in this process. So Franklin said I should start with some personal notes. So these are sort of some reflections from we all start doing things and we sort of push through with them, and then we don't always know where we end up. But it is the complexity of the situation is probably the one thing that still bothers me when I wake up in the mornings. How complex it is to deal with this reality, and how complex it is to negotiate a new deal for renewables with 100,000 people odd plus, depending on what you're going to do, and it is a crucial question. The other issue that goes with the complexity is the multidimensional nature of what we're talking about, and again that catches my eye every time I listen to myself and to everybody else, is that it is the various dimensions of community, of planning, of workers, of social stratification because of mining, and maybe the one thing that I try to always tell myself is it's not what we do at the end of the mine life cycle, but how we avoid these dependencies that we create during booms. And maybe we can sometimes avoid the booms as well in this reality. Finally, there's always this question of who will win and who will lose out on this thing. And so there's if you look at the current stratification, mine workers versus contract workers, mine workers versus non-mine worker families, the evidence points to contract workers, but also then the mine workers that will be in trouble. And it's probably the lower skilled mine workers that would find the wrong end of the problem. It's more in a country that's already unequal, that racial inequality but probably will continue through closure, except if we can find an appropriate alternative and deal with these problems, which I doubt a bit, but hopefully we have some hope as well. Franklin, thank you very much. That's my story. Hopefully I haven't taken too much time.
Not at all, Lochner. Thank you so much for your fascinating insights. Your book is both impressive and comprehensive. The coal question is clearly complex. Matters of water, health, life satisfaction, mine closure, and all possible aspects of the coal industry are systematically and empirically analyzed in the book, a copy of which I have here. I understand that continuing growth in South Africa, driven by coal mining, in sustainability language, more growth, is a recipe for more and more inequalities and stratification. But why is mine closure alone, in popular scientific speak, degrowth, not sufficient? That's my the question that's on my mind, Lochner. If you could perhaps reflect a bit on that and then
so of course it's not that simple, but I think the issue is that if we think about the industry still employing about 500,000 people, and it's largely in a sector where there are very little related industries. So if you're a mine worker, it's very difficult to find work elsewhere in the system. So just by saying that should happen, you're creating 500,000 households without jobs. And I think this is the conundrum. So there is the conundrum of trying to move away. On the other hand, trying to deal with families that have been dependent, not for their own reason necessarily, and you just put more pressure on them. You tell them to hold the risk of this thing totally in their hands, in the sense. And I think there's something about that, Franklin. It's probably a little bit more complex than what I'm trying to put out now, but I think that's the reality. So it's not just, we can't just say simply let go. I think we need to think about this very carefully, in a country where jobs are a problem, where inequalities are big. It's not as if we can just leave it, I think, but I could be wrong.
Thank you. That's clear. I feel persuaded by your reflections, Lochner. I have a question in the chat box. It's from I think the current head of the Department of Political Science and History at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Samuel, if you are very welcome to ask your question yourself. You may unmute yourself and
okay.
That's right. Good.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, the presenter, for such wonderful presentation. And I think I'm beginning to ask the need to look for this material and exhaust it, because it's a critical question. I'm interested in sustainability, but I'm also interested in how sustainable the coal industry would be the next 30 years. I'm also interested in the question around corporate social responsibility over the years. Would corporate social responsibility in this regard support the miners themselves, who are kith and kin of the communities in which they mine? Would it also, support the broader communities in which these mining activities take place? But in relation to that, the question around sustainability, what about new technologies? Would new technologies, for example, allow for this particular coal mining activity to subsist the next 30 years? So I'm thinking around that. The health-related questions, the question around global green discussions and all that. But if you can bounce off some ideas around that, I'll be grateful. Right.
Thank you, Samuel. Lochner, I think.
Yeah. So maybe just a footnote I read this morning, that with new environmental legislation, it would mean that about a third of the power stations would close down. They would not be able to comply to environmental legislation that South Africa has got on the books. Of course, this is a bit of a disaster in the approach, but so that's the first point. The second point is, so I hear lots of stories about coal and new technologies and things like that. I'm not in a position to comment about it. However, I need to make a couple of points about that. So you could potentially ensure that there's less air pollution through new technology. I think those technologies are developing. So it's not as if it's not possible. The problem is that that's what goes into the air. It's not what you take out of the ground, and it's not what you do underground in terms of pollution and environmental disasters. So that doesn't change much in the process. So I would think I would be very critical and cynical of thinking about all the talk about new technologies and thinking we're solving the problems in this regard. But it's not that I know the technologies and that I would make a firm commitment. There was something about CSR and thinking about how to deal with the environmental problems I heard, as well as with workers losing their jobs in this regard. I want to make two comments about it. The one is that CSR is typical of what I refer to as this front-end approach to the mining industry. To get the mining license, we need to show that we will not do harm. Okay, and that's what CSR is to my degree about. I don't think it's going to do anything about the closure problems and about problems post-closure, if I can put it in both ways. However, there is a South African system where there's a bit more of a closer relationship at what we call collaborative planning in terms of social and labor plans. And of course, the challenge is, can those social and labor plans help in dealing with some of these transition issues? My impression is that they're fairly weak. They don't want to deal with the hard difficulties, and that it requires a bit more than it requires an understanding of local situations and context, but it requires a far bigger response from everybody in this context if you want to deal with it in any significant way. Franklin, I hope I did answer the questions. I'm sorry, I can't always answer the questions about technology.
Thank you, Lochner. Yes, thanks for those reflections. I think someone says he's satisfied with your responses. Nina, our colleague connecting from Germany, has a question. I think Nina, it's I think if you can ask the question, if it's possible to ask the question yourself, then I think that will be wonderful. If not, yes.
Thank you, Franklin. Yes, thanks. So thank you, first of all, for the very, very interesting presentation. This is a topic close to my heart, and I found these outcomes very, very interesting, and we'll be sure to read the entire book once I get a little bit more time, maybe over the Christmas break. So my question would be related to the recent announcement at COP26 with some of the large countries, US, UK, France, Germany, EU, supporting South Africa with the coal phase out. And they also talk a lot about vocational training for local communities, for women, innovation hubs, and all of these different ways of supporting these communities. From a more sort of political perspective, and also what you spoke about, this issue being so complex, are these types of international assistance, the finance, and this help that comes in sort of on a international level, would you see that this can solve some of these issues that you have raised during the presentation, or does it also come with some issues? So thank you.
Yeah. I think I want to make 2 or 3 points. So the first point is simply the detail is still not available. So what it would mean specifically in a place like Emalahleni, it's not clear to me. It seems like it's low interest loans that will help doing this. My second impression is that I think the money is not enough. So that's the first, the second comment. And then the question is, will it make a difference? So on the one, I've got a sort of a two-sided answer to this. So of course, it should be helpful if it's appropriately thought through in the context. It should, however, and this is maybe my book, however, as well, is that I'm a bit cynical of these big plans and these top-down plans, and obviously we want to see the plan at some point, but I would, if you ask me now, will it make a substantial difference? Then I would probably say no, but I probably don't know. So I would also like to give it a good chance that it does work in a certain way and it does support communities in this regard. But I'm somewhat skeptical, but it might just be because that's me in the process. But I've seen numerous of these sort of large plans not always achieving what they think they should be achieving. So I'm a bit skeptical about that overall. But I think the right answer is probably to say let's see what the plan is and how it's locally contextualized for this area, and then comment on that in more detail. Maybe it's just premature to make any substantial comments about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. On the issue of contextualizing and waiting for details, I was also interested in some more details in your book, Lochner. You suggest that perhaps it's more appropriate to focus on limits to inequalities in our study of sustainability. So somewhere, in between Samuel and Nina's questions, my question is, what do inequalities actually look like in the coal towns in South Africa?
Yeah, so it's starting on, so in South Africa you can't talk about inequality without talking about race. So there is a substantial racial issue here. So just to give you an indication, so I would imagine that 90% of mine workers are black, but 99.9% of mine workers that are contract workers are black. If you see the difference, so there is a racial issue. The second thing is there's the inequalities created by mining. So there is just mine workers are generally better off in their livelihoods. However you measure it, or you try to measure it, or you try to understand it, that is the reality. But they're also the people at the highest risk here for closure, and having sort of substantial housing assets for many of them. Half of them probably does have, but they're at risk at losing some of that in the process. The other inequality that I think I sort of referred to in the discussion is that about informality and people, the day laborers. I'm in prostitution, and you can add people selling foodstuffs on a daily basis. So there's a substantial inequality around those who formally engage with the economy versus those who are on the informal side, and often those are also the people in informal housing. So that inequality is then, and we see that in the day laborers situation. So then runs across. It then becomes probably not in terms of day laborers, but generally in terms of women. So frankly, that's roughly, if I try to articulate it, it's probably a little bit more complex than what I'm trying to make it. But those are the ideas in my head.
On those matters of intersectional inequalities, they make me wonder whether your concluding your discussion in the conclusion about just transition is in fact an invitation for a broader discussion about just transformation, what Julia and Ajman at the beginning of this year discussed in the GSE as just sustainability. So
yeah, I think indeed, Franklin. So I think there's much room to. I mean, there's some literature you've done some of it yourself, challenging this notion of just transition at a very theoretical and conceptual level, which I think is important. But it's sort of the just sustainability and just transition stuff. Or sustainability is already a bit of a broader concept, which I think that I like a little bit more. Whether, of course, the question still is, can we achieve this? and is it possible? Are we so locked into existing systems that it's difficult? But I think indeed there's much room for conceptual expansion, but also then, as we've tried to do, to try to understand this at a local level and try to see how this might or might not play out in the future.
Many thanks, Lochner. The floor is still open for a general, much wider discussion using the chat box. I can see, I think there's another question from Samuel. Samuel, please, would you like to ask the question yourself? I think it's the only question I have in the chat box at the moment.
Okay, so I thanks, Prof. again, and thanks, Doc. So in his submission, he mentioned something about prostitution, and it seemed to be quite generic in a sense around West Africa, in Ghana, where myself and Prof. Obiodun comes from, mining areas where you have galamsey, gold mining and all that. You also see the element of prostitution and all that. But apart from the direct health impact, i.e. coming from pollution and all that, what are the related health impacts that come across as a result of prostitution, especially the questions around STDs and all that? And how is same impacting on the broader community, among other things? If we can share some more thoughts, maybe some anecdotes and some other empirical data, that would be interesting. Right.
Yeah, you're catching me a little bit off guard, yeah. In the sense that, but I think,
sorry, Prof. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. So I want to make two comments about it. So the one is related to Emalahleni and the health work. If I remember well, there is a substantial higher levels of HIV/AIDS, STDs in the area. So at the moment, managed largely by the mining companies through health interventions. The question, of course, is how does one do this beyond closure when the mining companies don't provide those services? So that's the one comment. The other comment I want to make, I've been doing some broader work lately about crime and mining decline. Now, just to contextualize this, that mining decline in this work that I'm busy doing is former gold mining areas. And there is something to gold that's a little bit different from coal and platinum and whatever that one needs to remember. However, the long and the short is that decline means on a range of crime indicators over nearly more than a decade, means substantially higher levels in mine decline areas, which are gold in the work that I've been doing. So the point is that decline brings with it even further issues around health and crime, and the question is to what degree those corporate social responsibility stuff are all on the front end. To what degree can we deal with these consequences at the back end in ways that make sense? Yeah, so sorry, that's a long answer to probably a far more simpler question, but I thought to bring that in as well.
Thank you, Lochner. I would like to bring the session to a close by making the following observations. The session has clearly been insightful, partly because of your penetrating questions, partly because of the tireless effort of my colleague, Sarah Marais, and particularly because of Professor Marais' stimulating address and authoritative responses to our many questions. So I'd like to thank all of you, especially Professor Marais, for leading the production of such an agenda-setting work. I understand that the book is freely available in open access form, but for paper book lovers or lovers of paper copies of books, copies could also be obtained from Edinburgh University Press and other online outlets. Following this pathway, the HELSUS Global South Encounters will return next year with a theme on ecological imperialism, and with it, ecological reparations. More details about the talks and our speakers will be made available on our web pages shortly. In the meanwhile, my colleagues join me in wishing you all a wonderful break. So happy holidays, and once again, thank you for joining, and see you again next year.